Hello again. All right, this is part four, uh, and this is why I believe the Bible. And the question is, did Jesus exist historically? Now, it may shock you to know that Jesus, one of the most attested, if not the most attested person historically. I'm not talking just from the Bible. So, for example, we have the eyewitness accounts of Mark, Luke, and John, in terms of record of eyewitness accounts. And so it would shock people to surprise that there's as much evidence for Jesus than any other historical figure, as much, yeah, minimum, if not more. So let's look in terms of some of the things, yeah. Let's look at some of that, some of the records. First person we have is a man called Tacitus, who lived from AD 55 to 120 AD. He was said to be the greatest Roman historian, lived throughout half a dozen emperors. So he'd record the emperors of Rome. Now, this is what he did. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abomination called Christians by the populace Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of his procurators, Pontius Pilate, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment again, broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So that's Tacitus, one of the greatest, said to be the greatest Roman historian. And it's interesting to note that scholars at one point, they didn't believe that Pontius Pilate actually existed. Archaeological evidence showed that it not only existed, but the same title was used in the Bible was actually used on this particular monument. So let's look at now. Here's an interesting one. Mara Bar Serapion, a letter written AD 73 in the British Library, was actually originally in the British Museum. Now, this letter, I can say I have seen personally. When I saw it, it was actually in the British Museum. So it says, this is what Mara Bar Seprion, who's written AD 73. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. So remember, the Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, 30, over 30 years after Christ was crucified. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samaritans were overrun by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, lived in complete dispersion. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new law he laid down. Now I said, I've seen this letter myself. I believe it's in the British Library, but when I saw it, it was in the British Museum. Did Jesus exist? We have Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, written AD 92 to 94. He was around the time of Titus' destruction, he's an eyewitness to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So he wrote a book, which is the complete works of Josephus, which I have here. And so what he says was, Festus was now dead and Albus was upon the road. So he assembled Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. His name was James. He's talking about the execution of James, Jesus' brother, and some others or some of his companions. And when he had formed the accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as far as who seemed the most excellent of the citizens, and such were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king Agrippa. So he's talking about the structure of James, but he also mentions Jesus in terms of the antiquity Jews. Pliny the Younger, they Christians were in the habit of meeting in a certain fixed day before it was light. So he was another historian of Rome, talking about the Christians when they sang internal hymns to Christ as to a God. So he holds a record of how the Christians at that time saw Jesus. So let me read that again. They Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang an alternate hymns versus a hymn to Christ as to God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and reassemble to partake of food of an ordinary and innocent kind. This wrote Pliny The epistles 1096. So this is Pliny the Younger was 115 AD. Let's look at the case for Julius Caesar. Now, nobody would deny that Julius Caesar exists. And this was saying be fair-minded. We have monuments about Julius Caesar, but in terms of writings about his life. So two of the most important sources of the emperor's life, however, was Suetonius and Plutarch, written in the early 2nd century. That's more than 100 years after the time of Caesar. Manuscript support lies behind these sources, and this is where things get really interesting. Around 12 manuscripts are essential for determining the wording of Caesar's account. The oldest manuscript is from the 9th century, full 900 years removed from the actual events. This list extends to manuscripts from the 12th century. Cicero's speeches have an even older pedigree. There are 15 manuscripts ranging from 400 AD to 800 AD. So when we do ancient, the number of manuscripts in the New Testament is 5,000, roughly 5,800 record of the New Testament. So you've got portions, which is a small portion. Oldest portion of the Bible is in John's Gospel, which is in Manchester, the John Rylands Museum. I've seen that as well. And that is 100 years after Christ. 100 years after Christ. 5,000. So you've got whole books of the New Testament, and you also have little parts of the New Testament. But it's 5,800. There's 2,300 New Testament in different languages. As I said before, you've got Ethiopic, the Boric, the Coptic, you've got Syriac, you've got Latin, you've got Old Latin, all these different languages the New Testament was written in, and we have copies of those. The nearest one is Homer's Iliad, which is 1,900 copies of Homer's Iliad. Yeah. So, for example, Caesar's Gallic Wars is only 251. Compared to New Testament, 5,800. You've got Virgins, which is 2,300. So it's really incomparable in terms of the number of manuscripts. We also look at the dating. Yeah. So you've got years, hundreds of years. Now, with the New Testament, I said the oldest portion of the Bible, of the New Testament, is 100 years, which is found in John Rylands Museum. Oldest New Testament, pre-Bible, New Testament Bible, is in the British Library, which is Codex Sinaiticus, which is the 4th century. So we have numerous portions of the New Testament, refer to the New Testament, and nothing compares in terms of the time that the originals were written to copies that we have. It's closer with the New Testament. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do, we're going to finish on that point, and we're going to deal with, in our next session, the empty tomb. The empty tomb. Very interesting. That one's going to be very interesting. We're warming up now. All right. May God bless you, keep you, and may cause his face to shine upon you.